This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin. Joining me this week, two giant telepathic starfish from outer space, Zanne Domoney-Lyttle.
Hello, hi.
And Paul Jasley.
Hey, humanoids.
Thank you both for joining me this week. I'm very excited to talk about comic books, but before we get into things, I do want to read something that we wrote in preparation for the episode. Before we start the show today, I want to speak on behalf of the podcast in regards to the troubling increase in anti-Asian racism over the past year. We at I Read Comic Books offer our sympathy, support, and solidarity with the members of the Asian and Pacific Islander community. I encourage all of our listeners to learn more about this issue and find ways you can help. We recommend visiting stopaapihate.org or follow Stop AAPI Hate on social media. Check our show notes for links to this group's website and GoFundMe campaign. We believe that by working together, we can crush racism and stop the hate. Paul, you and I just recorded an episode not too long ago that released on our Patreon about Superman Smashes the Klan, and it seems like strangely timely, like in the worst way possible, to talk about such an amazing comic book that addresses something that's happening right now in the United States. And so I figured wanted to say something on this week's episode because the world just continues, you know?
Yeah. And I think if you have a platform like we do with the podcast, it behooves you to make a statement like that. So thanks, Mike.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's get into things. This is episode 279 of I Read Comic Books. We have a special guest on our show, Zanne Domoney-Lyttle. Zanne, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into things, could you tell the people at home a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. So I'm a researcher and a lecturer in the intersection of Bible and popular culture at the University of Glasgow. And I specialize in gender, sexuality, comic books, and religion. So that's a little bit about my background and my history with comics.
Very cool. Very cool. We're really excited to talk to you about a very serious topic today. This whole episode is going to be maybe a little bit more serious, but really glad to have you here. Really excited to talk about things. And honestly, like what you've been studying and the things that I've been able to read online that you've written and stuff, very interesting stuff. I'm genuinely curious, like what got you interested in like religious studies and that overlap with comics?
That's something that I wanted to talk about a little bit later today. But basically, I find comics a really interesting vehicle for dealing with things like religion and cultural expression and politics and so forth. So for me, it was a really natural fit. And somebody, my supervisor at university when I was doing my undergraduate, introduced me to Robert Crumb's Book of Genesis. And that basically started the whole thing for me. So it's been about 11 years since then. And that's basically all I read now is a religious style comics or comics that deal with religion and culture and politics.
Gotcha. Very cool. Well, we will get into it a little bit later in this episode, given today's topic. But I guess before we dive too deep into things, I got to ask my legally mandated questions for the show, which is how have you been? How have comic books been? So Zanne, could you tell us a little bit about that? What have you been reading? How you been?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been really good, thank you. Things are a bit wet and dismal and grey in Scotland, but that's springtime for you in Glasgow. So I've had quite a lot of time to read lately because of the weather. And my most recent reads have been Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, Prostitution and Religious Obedience in the Bible by Chester Brown. And I've also been keeping up with The Goddamned, The Virgin Brides volume, series 2 it is now, yeah.
Gotcha. I've never read The Goddamned. How is that book so far and the issues that you've read?
It is weird. It's really strange. It's violent. It's gory. It's got really cool little flicks to the Bible. If you know your Bible, you'll recognize them. It's really fun to read as well. But it's good fodder for the mind too. There's lots of things going on there that you can think about deeper if you want to. So I'm really enjoying it.
Okay. See, that's really interesting because when I saw this book, I was just like, oh, there goes Jason Aaron. He's doing another Viking book or he's doing another just, straight nonstop action flick. But you're telling me that there is a little bit more to this than meets the eye?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of sort of snide commentary on gender and sexuality and violence against women, and but again also just a lot of crazy weird stuff like talking snakes, as you would find in Genesis and the Garden of Eden and things like that too. So it's really fun that way. But if you want to go deeper, you definitely can with this book.
Very cool. Could you tell me a little bit more about this Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus book? I have never heard of this. I mean, I know Drawn and Quarterly, it's a really small publisher, so they do a lot of like very super niche things, and this seems very super niche.
Yeah, it is quite niche, but it's actually a follow-up to Chester Brown's 2011 comic that he produced, Paying for It. And Paying for It is about his sort of journey with sex work. Basically, he's a John in the sex work world.
Okay.
And so Paying for It was a biography of his experience using sex workers. And Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus is a follow-up of that, where he basically retells a bunch of biblical stories, but argues that they take a pro-sex work stance. And that actually, the amount of research that he's done that's gone into this comic book, he claims that actually sex work was, very normal and not only popular, but a positive part of ancient cultural history. So it's been really interesting to see his tweaks and his takes on those stories. Mm-hmm. I can't say that I agree with them all as a biblical scholar.
Sure.
But the amount of research that he's gone into it, the bibliography is huge. He has this commentary section at the back where he tells you why he's made certain choices about retelling, like the Abel and Cain story and the Tamar story and the Ruth story and so forth. And it's a really, I love it when people do this sort of work, because biblical scholars can be really boring and dry. And this is like a whole new way of looking at the Bible, which is way more exciting. So I totally recommend it. It's a small little book, really, really, as in size, but it's quite chunky. I totally recommend reading it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I this sounds like a very, like you said, very different take on things. So I'm definitely interested. I've never really read too much like comics about the Bible. I knew about Genesis by R. Crumb, but we'll get into the second half, because I've just got a million and one questions about this kind of stuff.
Sure.
So Paul, I guess, what about you? How have you been? How have comic books been?
I've been good, Mike. I'll be getting my second dose of Moderna this coming Friday, so I'm weirdly optimistic about the future. So it feels good. Nice. And I've been reading some comics. No matter how many comics I read, I'm perpetually like 2 weeks behind. Like I'm always like 2 weeks behind on my weekly books. So I read a few things that are a few weeks old. So, but they're new to me. And I don't think anyone else talked about them on the show yet. So hopefully they're new to you. I read two books that were weirdly sort of very similar. It's always interesting to read two comic books by different creative teams, different publishers that somehow seem to overlap a lot. And those were The Plot, number 8, and The Swamp Thing, number 1. So The Plot, of course, is the Vault Comics series written by Tim Daniel and Michael Morkai. Art by Joshua Hickson, colors by Kurt Michael Russell. The Swamp Thing number 1 is a 10-issue limited series from DC, written by Ram V, art by Mike Perkins, colors by Mike Spicer. Both books are about family curses and bog monsters, or swamp monsters, I guess, literally for Swamp Thing. So it's just funny to read them back to back like I did. This is the final issue of The Plot, which was kind of interesting because for some reason I thought the book had already ended. So when I got another issue of it, I was like, oh, maybe this is a new volume of the story. But as I was reading it, I was convinced this is very clearly the conclusion of the story. So if you haven't read that book, it's one of the best horror comics I've read in a long time. I think horror is a genre that obviously has a long history in comic books, but it's hard to do well just by the nature of the medium itself, Since horror films rely on that sort of jump scares and quick cuts, a comic, you can't really do that unless you have the big reveal at the page turn. This book does it really well. It's very creepy. It's about a cursed sort of haunted house, family mystery, and a bog monster that's haunting the family. So I don't want to get too deep into the details again, because the conclusion, without spoiling anything, it's a very satisfying conclusion to the story. And it really made me want to go back and reread the whole series to kind of get the full picture of it. So can't recommend that one enough. And then Swamp Thing, this is the new Swamp Thing series written by Ron V. I didn't read the Future State Swamp Thing mini, so I don't know if there's a lot of backstory to this new Swamp Thing, but it's a different person. It's not Alec Holland. And this new Swamp Thing is Levi Kamei. He's returning home to New York after going over to India to visit his estranged father on his deathbed. So again, it's about family curses or family lineage, and it turns out this guy turns into Swamp Thing, of course. And it's about a man who's in search of his roots, pun intended, becoming Swamp Thing. He has these horrific visions. The artwork by Mike Perkins is perfectly creepy and spooky the way Swamp Thing should be. And I'm just glad that it feels like a proper horror take on Swamp Thing. That's a character that never really works for me in a superhero setting, but if you go back to the horror roots of the character, it totally works. And I think I'm pretty excited to see where they take this book.
I mean, I'm hoping that Ram V is giving this book the like Immortal Hulk treatment, you know? Like Hulk is an interesting character in some ways, not a great superhero, but when you get into that horror element of things, come on, right? Like, I'm hoping that that's what we're seeing with this Swamp Thing book. I have yet to read this book, but I plan on picking it up. So it's good to hear that the first issue was good.
Yeah, it's very solid. Again, even if you don't know a lot about Swamp Thing, I think this is a perfect introduction to the character and the mythology. So it's a great jumping on point, obviously, since it's a number one.
Well, for me this week, I am currently in the process of packing because I am moving out of the big city. I'm no longer going to be a big city boy. Instead, I'm going to be a New Jersey person. And I don't know what you call those people, but that's what I'm going to be. So, slightly packing slowly over time over the next 2 weeks before we move. It's going to be a whole thing. Cinco in the chat says that I'm going to become a Jersey boy. That's just what it is. There's probably a Bruce Springsteen song going to be written about me as we speak. But when I'm not dealing with that stress, I'm trying to read comics. I finally finished Hikaru no Go as part of the manga read along series that we're doing on Discord. I was like a day late, but what an ending. Might be one of the most exciting, fun manga reads you could ever read. I don't know. I read the first arc of Demon Slayer because Kelly started watching the anime and I wanted to be able to talk to her about it. So just really quick on those. But the other things that I read that I have a little bit more to say about is I read Barbalien Red Planet number 5. This is by Tate Brombell and Jeff Lemire with art by Gabriel Walta, colors by Jordi Belair. If you haven't been following along with this series and you haven't really read much of Black Hammer, I will say, this is the last issue in the arc. And the only thing that I can really say about it is this is quite an end to what feels like one of the most real stories in the Black Hammer universe. In the Black Hammer universe, it's very much a mix of Avengers and Justice League and a couple of other things all at once. But the Barbalien story about this Martian character, that comes to Earth and changes his personality, and we really didn't get to explore him too much outside of some casual bits or some smaller bits and pieces throughout the other Black Hammer stories. But to see this miniseries focused on Barbalien and explaining why the character is the way that he is probably, it's extremely devastating and incredibly sad, given the subject matter, which is, his name is not John Johns, but I want to say John Johns. Marks, I think is his name. He comes to, I believe it's San Francisco, working as a police officer right in the middle of like the AIDS epidemic. And he is a, homosexual man, or I guess like he's a homosexual like Martian, which makes him a homosexual human or something. I don't know how you really explain it. So him as a police officer at that time, it's just not great, obviously. And it's a super powerful story from beginning to end. So I honestly think that if you just picked up this Barbalien Red Planet by itself and read it, you would understand the impact. You don't need to know the whole backstory of everything that happened in the Black Hammer series to read it. I think it's a pretty powerful story, and to bring Tate Brombell on to tell that story, because I don't like Jeff Lemire. I don't think is trying to appropriate telling the story of like a queer person in the 80s and 90s in the United States. So it's interesting to see that story play out, and it's super moving, I will say. So really, really solid. I highly recommend that whole arc. Barbalien Red Planet 1 through 5 is amazing. The other book that I read is I Killed Adolf Hitler. This is by Jason, published by Fantagraphics. I think, Paul, you told me to read this.
It couldn't have been me because I've never read it. So yeah, but it seems like something I would recommend. So yeah.
Yeah. So somebody told me to read this book, and I don't remember who. Maybe someone in the chat can remind me. But which, by the way, folks are listening live on Discord as we record today's episode. So if you want to do that, ircbpodcast.com/Discord. Got to get that plug in. But I read this book not really knowing what it was. If you've ever browsed Comixology, you've ever looked at Fantagraphics' backlog of comics, you'll notice that they have a ton of books by this creator called Jason, and they all seem to feature these anthropomorphic cat-like people. So I don't know, out of the blue, someone told me to check this out. So I borrowed it on Comixology Unlimited and I started reading it. And it's like 53 pages, and it reads like, I don't want to say artsy, but just a lot of Fantagraphic books in general, where it's not really going to hook you. It's not really a book that's trying to like get you sucked in the first 5 pages. It's kind of just a story. It's a spread of bland pieces and tidbits that end really quickly, and they seem really harsh. Like the opening of this book is the main character. He's an assassin and he's like sniping someone, and there's this woman on the bed who wants him to have sex with her, but like he won't because he needs to make this kill. And like, if you were reading this from like Image or from Boom or something, the creator and the artist would probably make things a bit like sexier overall. But this book, it just felt so bland and plain, and I don't know how else to describe it. That isn't to say that this book isn't interesting, because there's like a slow quality to this book. You see this in a lot of other Fantagraphics books, I think, like Mega Hex or Fonte Bukowski or Cosplayers, where there's like the tension of the book lies in the dullness of everything, and the action happens suddenly without a buildup, like the sound of like a firecracker in a silent room where you didn't even know it was going to happen, and then suddenly things are changing. Some people would call that poor storytelling. Other people would call that the way that a lot of indie books are written. So I don't know. Is that a dig at indie books? Maybe it is. It sounds really shitty when it came out of my mouth, but that's how I thought about it. Ultimately, this book, it doesn't seem like it says much. It definitely tells a story about a guy who goes back in time and kills Hitler, but he doesn't kill Hitler. And I don't know. It feels weird. It's like a really bad Looper spoof or something. I don't know if I liked it. Every single Fantagraphics book like this that I get, and I know that it's part of like some creators like backlog of stories, I'm just like, well, now I got to read the other 12 because I feel like I didn't understand this one. Maybe if I read the other 11, I'll get the charm of it. So yeah, there's a bunch of these books, and I happen to pick the one that has the most, outrageous title to start with, and maybe that's the worst one. So now I got to read the other ones that are out there. Anyways. You guys ever want to kill Hitler? Ever think about that? Sorry, Ben.
I kind of want to read this book now, actually, to be honest.
Yeah, you actually sold it pretty well, Mike.
God damn it. I don't think that was my intent. But okay. Well, you guys check this out if you get a chance to read it. Let me know what you think. Maybe I missed something. Maybe this is the problem with these books. I feel like I don't understand like the intricate pieces of the storytelling that they're doing. I've been reading comics and trying to dissect them and understand them at like a more than surface level for like 10 years. And sometimes I read books like this and I go, I feel like I just started reading comics yesterday, Yeah. So I don't know. Anyways, let's move on. Let's talk about comic books that are coming out in the upcoming week. Comic books are dropping on March 31st, 2021 here in the United States. So let's see what you guys are excited about. Paul, what about you? What are you excited about this week as I stumble over all my words?
Mike, I am excited for Beta Ray Bill #1. This is spinning out of Thor, which I'm not reading, and it also seems to be spinning out of the King in Black event in Marvel, which I didn't read, but it's written and drawn by Daniel Warren Johnson, and it's about a big old space horse with an axe. As Stanley once said, enough said, I love Daniel Warren Johnson's artwork. I think him drawing a sort of Thor-centric book makes a ton of sense. Beta Ray Bill is one of those characters that it's always a thrill when he pops up. Sometimes there's just certain characters that you don't even like think about or have much connection to, but they just look cool. And I think that's Beta Ray Bill for me. So having an artist draw a character that has such a distinct look, it's pretty exciting. So yes, I'm going to dive into Marvel and read a book that I have no idea what it's going to be about. I just know it'll probably look really nice.
Zanne, are you a big like Marvel or DC reader at all when you're not reading, the Goddamned and other biblical books?
Yeah, I used to be quite into DC, but not so much anymore. And I think partly it's because I'm working on a book at the moment, which is due at my publishers imminently. So my head has been completely in the game of Bible and comics, and I haven't had much space to look elsewhere. But actually, you guys have given me a lot of recommendations that once this book is in at the publishers in the end of April, I've got lots of things to look forward to reading.
Right. Perfect. Isn't there, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong here, there's probably some sort of book out there that makes, some sort of hint that Superman is Jesus, right? That's something you could read as part of your book,
my gosh.
right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah, I wrote an undergraduate dissertation on that. We could talk about that.
Oh my God. Okay.
Perfect.
Well, I love this. Okay, but before we get into that, I guess, Zanne, what are you excited for this upcoming week?
Yeah, so I cheated a little bit here, and it is partly because I don't have my head in the game at the moment, again, until I get this book out of the way. So for me, I'm really looking forward to issue 5 of the Goddamned Volume 2. It's not out until the end of April,
sure.
And it's been a huge gap since the last issue, which was out in November last year, I think. So I'm just like, I'm like, get this book in, and then I can get that, and I can learn what happens with the talking snake and the crazy Nephilim babies and all of that sort of stuff. So, I'm rooting for the end of April. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Well, I guess before I get into my pick for this week, since it's 2021, as I've been announcing every other week, if you share the show on social media and tag us, you can win a $20 gift card to Comixology or Midtown Comics or your local comic shop if they offer that kind of stuff. This year, we want to really help people read comic books, so share the show. We'll send you $20. This week's winner is, I'm going to try to pronounce this, Hufflepugus. Is that what that's supposed to be? Hufflepugus on Instagram. So thank you so much for sharing the show. I think you shared some stickers that we sent you. So thank you again. I'm going to reach out with the DM and get you a $20 gift card to your place of choice. I also want to mention some of the folks on Discord shouted out their comic picks for this week. Cinco is picking The Department of Truth #7. Nick is picking Young Hellboy #2. And Danny is also picking Beta Ray Bill #1. So Paul, I expect you to have a conversation with Danny about this since neither of you know what's going on with this book, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
For me this week, I was going to pick the Department of Truth, but I figure I can't pick every single issue of that book, or between me and Paul, it can't just be, every time that book comes out. So I'm picking Decorum #7. Hopefully this is coming out. John Hickman, Mike Huddleston. My thought is new arc Who Dis. I think #6 ended with an arc, but #6 came out months and months ago. Classic Hickman book. I honestly don't know why I buy this book in single issues, because it reads so much better as arcs. I read #6 in one go, and it was like absolutely necessary for me to understand everything that was going on. Honestly, though, I think the reason I get this book monthly is only, one, to make sure that it stays alive, and two, because I just kind of want to flip through a book that has Mike Huddleston's art. He's so disgustingly talented. Everyone just needs to look at some pages from this book. I think when #6 came out, I talked about this at length. Like, I was sharing pictures with Nick about this because he and I were just talking one night, and I couldn't believe, like, from page to page to page, that it was all the same artist. If you're someone that likes Marco Rudy and other artists who kind of like change their style from page to page like that, this is another one of those creators who is multifaceted and shows it off in every book that they're working on. So Decorum #7 is probably going to be exciting. I'm probably just going to sit on it for the next like 6 to 8 months until the next arc comes out, but we'll see. But yeah, that's my pick for this week, and I'm really excited to see how it goes. And yeah, I guess with that, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about this week's topic, which is a big one. We said it was going to be serious. The question is, do current events shape how you read comic books, and a little bit more? So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to dive right inside that. For our show this week, we are asking the questions: do current events shape how you read comics? Do you see themes in comics that reflect the current political climate? I feel like the second question is a bit more obvious than the first. But, I guess to kind of get the thing started with the first question, do current events shape how you read comics? I mean, my answer is torn in two ways, right? The idea of, I want to engage more when I learn about things, but also I want to escape from the world by reading comics, and I think you see a lot of people out there who just like, comics aren't inherently political, I just want to read comics. Like, we're not talking about that today, but like there is kind of like, you jump into fantastical elements of things to kind of get away from the somewhat, harsh reality of life. But I'm curious to know, I guess, Zanne, I think you've got a very interesting position to be in. I said you've been reading a lot of comics about the Bible and stuff, and like the cross section between comics and the Bible. Do you still feel like books that are written like that, like, try to reflect current society? Or is it, like the book you talked about before, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus, seems like someone's interpretation of the Bible based on their current, like, opinion of the world? Do you see like an overlap in things that like influences, like, I guess the political, or that is influenced by the political climate when you're like reading comics like that?
Yes, absolutely. And my answer to the question is unequivocally yes.
Okay.
Current events do shape how we read comics, and yet it is a good place to start if we think about religion and Bible and comics and the intersections between them all. I mentioned Robert Crumb earlier, but his Genesis comes to mind immediately, because for him it was a faithful word for word interpretation of the book of Genesis, except that there is no single book of Genesis, there is no original text, and he had to put his own interpretation on it, and his interpretation was really biased by a bunch of stuff he'd been reading about how women were super powerful, and it was almost this pro-feminist idea that he put into the pages of Genesis, which don't really exist and tie up if we look at the biblical Hebrew that he was drawing from as well. So for me, I'm like, yes, absolutely. He might not recognize that he's, as in Robert Crumb might not recognize that he's, used his own interpretation and agenda and bias to create this book of Genesis, but it does reflect this feminist, some people might argue post-feminist, world that we live in. And again, you see it with Chester Brown's Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus. It's very pro-sex work, which has contemporary parallels with a lot of the discussions and arguments we're having at the moment regarding sex work as labor. So yes, unequivocally, the more aware I become of news and social justice issues and political events, the more I see them reflected in things that I read, whether that's intentional or not.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Paul, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, Mike, as someone who read a lot of Judge Dredd comics last year, I can say yes, yeah. Absolutely current events shape how I read comics, particularly Judge Dredd comics. So, yeah, it's comics aren't created in a vacuum and you can't read them in a vacuum. So no matter what the creator's intent might be, I think you're always going to bring what's in the back of your mind to what you're reading. And, it's really interesting to me because, again, there was a lot of stuff I was reading last summer about Judge Dredd, particularly the Day of Chaos storyline, which came out like almost 10 years ago, but it's about a deadly virus that kills 87% of Mega City 1's residents. It's really hard to not think about, our current situation while reading that book. But at the same time, I felt it helped me cope with things. There was a lot to deal with last summer, obviously, and from all different directions, and is overwhelming. And yet even a book that sort of reminded me of that, there was enough of a distance because it was fictional to kind of help me cope and understand and deal with the very real life consequences of the coronavirus and everything else last year. So in a weird way, it was almost comforting to read a book like that because it allowed me to process my feelings about that stuff in an interesting way.
Right. I mean, this is like everyone watching that movie. I think a movie was called Pandemic or something that came out. Yeah. That's I don't even remember it. It's a movie that was very popular on Netflix, like right after, all the COVID stuff happened. Like, I think, people want to see like a resolution in some sort of fiction. Oh, Danny corrected me. Outbreak. That was the big one.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's so bizarre. I mean, not to make this all about COVID, but just to hear like, people want to see something like that where they can escape into a fictional world where there is a little bit more management because it is in like a fictional space. Whereas, when I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about, current events and in terms of like, like the Black Lives Matter movement and, all the stuff that's happening right now, with the Asian American folks and Pacific Islander folks. And I'm just like, I want to learn more about like what's actually happening from people's perspectives. And also, how has this, these stories have existed for a long time where you see like, this isn't a new thing, what's happening when it comes to these types of movements. And to see other people tell these stories, to educate myself, to better, to be a better ally and things like that. I look to comics to try to learn, which is something that is maybe strange to some people to hear. I think on this show we've talked enough about how the fact that like we don't treat comics like children's things, because comics are serious, and they are things for people of all ages. The best medium to learn things, yada yada. We've spoken to that a lot, but I think comic books offer an interesting way for people to digest information. And so like when I asked the question, do current events shape how I read comics, it's like it forces me to try to look and find comics about current events that are happening, because 9 times out of 10 they're not brand new. I'm sure that you could find there are comics talking about plagues, there are comics talking about people standing up to the police, there are comics talking about all these different topics that have been around for a while. And like I think back about a few years ago when I sat down to read March, and I was just like, holy shit, this is not a new thing. Like I was aware of the civil rights movement from like going to American high school or American middle school where you learn about it for a hot minute. But to actually, read something about John Lewis's life it's insane to see that, 40, 50 years ago, these same problems that are happening today were happening to people across the country. So I feel like I try to educate myself through that rather than turning to prose books because I find them harder to engage with, I guess.
That sort of distance I don't know how else to say it, but there's sort of a distance you can kind of put between yourself and the material when it's mediated through comics. That sort of visual element makes things almost easier to wrap your brain around, I think. So, anyway.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think as well that the beauty of comics is that the way that they are produced, they can respond to political events and social justice issues and all of these things and coronavirus and anything else that's happening in the world in a really timely manner that not many other cultural products can do. So that makes them fairly unique in that respect as an educational tool as well, because they're sort of recording history as they go, which not many things can do that so quickly.
Definitely. I mean, I think that there's, a lot of online creators who, immediately had responses to things, ready to go, whether, on any subject matter, when current events are happening, like putting together a digital comic to toss out, to say like how you're feeling or to add your story to the greater story of what's happening. I didn't even consider that idea of the fast turnaround for things because prose books take a while to come out. TV shows take even longer. Same with movies. So yeah, that's a wonderful observation.
It's something that I notice when I go back and read comics, particularly like from the 60s and 70s when they're being churned out so quickly. When I go back and read Jack Kirby comics, again, he's operating on such a fast pace that whatever's in his mind is coming out almost subconsciously through the comics, whether he's aware of it or not. But when you read The New Gods, it's clearly about him trying to understand World War II, which again is something we're still sort of dealing with as a society. It's not just about space gods. There's something deeper there. And like OMAC is a book that's about the implications of technology and how that changes humanity and changes our society. It's there in the text, whether he intended it or not. So it's always interesting to go back and read that stuff. And I think it's because it was being produced at such a fast rate. It was there whether Kirby or Stanley intended it or not.
Right. And the same thing is happening, if you go back to the beginning of Superman in the 30s, being written as a response to violence against Jewish communities perpetrated by the Nazis. So he's this protector of this Jewish community, but he actually goes on, his cultural acclaim extends to become the protector of the world. But his beginnings are really actually quite humble. And it's about this social justice warrior in response to something terrible that's happening in the world.
I mean, Superman might be, I think, again, I'm biased towards Superman, but I think he might be the best example of how you can reflect or how pop culture reflects the time. Superman has changed as culture has changed around him. He's always reflected the popular values of when the stories are being told. There's actually a really great book called Superman, the Unauthorized Biography, written by Glenn Weldon, that's the purpose of the book. He goes through decade by decade through Superman and says, this is what Superman stories were like at this time. Here's how they reflected society. And I think as a cultural icon, he might be the best example of how culture impacts comics and how as a reader, you can read into what culture is like at that moment by reading comics,
Yeah, I love that. And I agreed with your point earlier that I think that the reader is the person who brings their own baggage and their own weight to the texts rather than the author. Once it leaves the hand of the author, it doesn't matter what they intended. It matters what you read into it. And comics are a particularly good vehicle for that as well. And the thing is as well, Mike, you talked about, you want to escape and you want to read and for fun. And you get to do that if you want to. So if we think about the X-Men, for example, you might pick that up for sort of a quick break from reality, but others might pick it up and see representation of themselves because they're talking about things like marginalization and oppression of minority groups. So that's the other really cool thing about comics is their dual identity, that some people can just have fun with them and not think any deeper, and others can be like, okay, cool, I feel seen. And that's really powerful.
Absolutely. First off, I want to just say, how dare you with the X-Men? There's no politics in the X-Men. I'm just kidding.
Sorry, my bad.
No. No, I absolutely agree with that because I think, that's the thing that's always made, I've gotten on this soapbox a lot and I said in the break, no soapboxes. And yet here I am. I've said this before, the X-Men are such an interesting thing because I absolutely agree. Like you can take it on at many, many levels. And I think you look at the X community, like the folks that read a lot of the X-Men books, and they are digging in and they are finding pieces and things that are either intended or not intended by the authors to try to grab something to either hold on to represent themselves or to represent a community or to say like, this is something great about like this is what makes the X-Men great. And I've always loved that about them because I think like ultimately the X-Men to me always means hope. And and I don't want to get into it too much because I do want to like kind of dig into some of the other thoughts that you guys had about this. Because, when it comes to like, I think the X-Men analogy is not as serious seriously reflected in the text as it was maybe like 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, because the whole direction that the X-Men have taken about like creating this utopia of the world, which is like in a way like kind of a futuristic look of people to say like, you know, we're going to move and do our own thing. And we're not trying to exclude anybody, but we have to in order to save ourselves, in order to save our species as far as they're concerned. And, you know, at the same time, they aren't necessarily trying to say like, this is an exclusive club. This is we are a tribe of people, and we need to be together in order for ourselves to succeed. And we will integrate with the world in a way that is beneficial to everybody. Like they are offering, you know, they offer medicine and all these other things to basically cure disease and all this other stuff that makes the world ultimately better. But all they're asking is to be left alone, you know. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because it brings up this idea of, you know, it like self-exclusion, like intentionally self-excluding yourself, but not in a way that where like the power dynamics are like someone in a position of power is creating that segregation. And instead, the like people with less power, I guess, are the ones choosing to say like, we want to be separate, but not in a way that is like damning to us and makes us worse. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to be said about the X-Men, I think.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah,
interesting, Mike.
Like a really cool parallel there is obviously like the early various sects of Christianity, you know, that started after the death of Jesus in a Jewish majority or Greek majority culture, who were doing really the same thing. So again, we're seeing these stories repeat themselves in various different guises and forms, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mike, you know, not to belabor the point, but you're talking about the X-Men, and I think what's interesting is that, you know, I read the House of X, Powers of 10, so I've read that, and what's so interesting is that really felt like an attempt to move away from the civil rights reading of the X-Men. Again, you know,
Sure.
So Jack and Stan, when they created the X-Men, they weren't thinking about civil rights or Black liberation movements at all. It's the readers of those books who later on said, hey, maybe Professor X is Martin Luther King, or maybe Magneto is Malcolm X. We can map our experience onto these fictional characters. That was never the intent, but that's kind of what the X-Men became. And it's interesting to see attempts to move away from that. I think, again, the other big X-Men storyline I'm sort of familiar with is Grant Morrison's X-Men. And Morrison very clearly is trying to move beyond that and move the X-Men into a different place. And people weren't maybe ready for that. But I think that shows how creators are trying to engage this material in a different way, you know, or whether or readers are able to engage with it in a different way over time.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see where you're coming from with that. And I don't want to make this an X-Men centric podcast, because I definitely will do that. If anybody who listens to the show knows me well enough. So I guess to kind of to skip past that, were there other things, I guess, like have there been any comics recently that you've read that you've picked up simply because of things that are going on in the world? And obviously, you know, Paul, you said you picked up this book of Judge Dredd about the, you know, this pandemic or this virus that killed a bunch of people. But I guess beyond that, you know, like, are there other things that you were influenced by, like current political things or just the climate in general, to say, you know, I want to read more about this, and it's something you found that was really, really good?
You know, the one example that stands out, it's a few years old at this point, but the book Rolling Blackouts by Sarah Glidden. It's about the refugee crisis in Iraq, Turkey, and Syria following the invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s. It's a very, very well-researched book. It's almost journalism. You know, it's a real story. Sarah Glidden is going to these places. She's with a group of independent journalists, and the book is not only about current events and the sort of humanitarian tragedy of the refugee crisis, it's also a meditation on how journalists responsibly report on these issues without bringing their own bias to it, or if that's even possible. It's a tremendous book that carries a ton of weight, but it's also very readable and enjoyable as a reading experience, even though it's such a heavy, heavy subject and such a complex issue. I mean, that's a book that I go back to often because I had such an amazing reaction to it. So yeah, Rolling Blackouts by Sarah Glidden is the first book that came to mind when I read this topic.
Gotcha. I've never heard of that, and this is also why I brought you two on. I want to find books that I haven't read yet. So if you guys, this is basically just me curating a reading list from two comic book experts, as far as I'm concerned. Zanne, what about you? Was there any books that you've read recently that have kind of like had an influence on you, or like you read because of things that were going on?
Yeah, one in particular that came to my mind is by somebody called Kate Charlesworth. And Kate Charlesworth's quite a big name in the UK indie scene. And she wrote basically a history of the LGBTQI community in the UK from 1950 up until basically like 2019, 2020.
Oh, wow.
When the book was published. And it's amazing. It's like a little bit of her drawing, a little bit of her commentary. There's like collage in there from tickets to pride marches and buttons and ribbons, and so it's a real big feast for the eyes. But it just really made me, when I read it, stop and think, like, firstly how far we've come, but also how long it's taken to get not very far at all. So when Kate was born in 1950, for example, it was illegal to be a man and gay, but it was never illegal for a woman to be a lesbian. And Kate is a lesbian and grew up in Yorkshire, where, small town, and had to deal with all of those sorts of things. So she chronicles what it's like to be a lesbian in a small Yorkshire town, when it's not even an offense to be so, because that's how invisible they felt as part of the community. And I sort of picked it up last year. I saw Kate give a talk, and I just thought, the LGBTQI community goes through so much hardship and discrimination, and it seems to be never ending. So I wanted to educate myself on that, and when I picked that up, it was just like, it completely blew me away. The amount of work that's in there is amazing. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, but just the history as well just really reminds you that, like I said, like, we have come really far, but also we haven't gone far enough.
Right. And
like, our sisters and our brothers and our trans friends and our non-binary friends are still continuously being discriminated against and part of this oppressive society that we're all complicit in. So that is me getting on my soapbox. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm curious about the title though. So you said it's called Sensible Footwear. Is like, are shoes somehow like a part of the story here?
Yeah, so it's Sensible Footwear, a girl's guide. And I suppose it's sort of a commentary on, in one way, that look, if you were a lesbian in the 70s and 80s, sort of wearing men's shoes and wearing sensible shoes, and, not wearing the feminine high heels, because there's a look that you ascribe to if you're lesbian and so forth. So I think it's a little bit of a nod to that, as well as some other things going on.
Gotcha. I mean, that's an interesting, I just looked up the cover. It's a beautiful looking book. So, we'll add some of these to the show notes too, for folks that are curious, but yeah, that's an interesting thing. I would have never thought that that cover to that book would have told me about the history of the LGBTQI scene. Well, cool.
Absolutely.
One of the books that I was thinking about, we've talked a little bit about, things. I mentioned March earlier. One of the books that I was thinking about was Cannabis, the Illegalization of Weed in America by Box Brown.
Oh, yeah.
And at this point, I'm just, this is all Paul's fault, but I'm just like a Box Brown person. Like, anytime he puts out a book, I'm picking it up because I'm a sucker. But, I read that book, and while I don't think it's maybe his most like compelling book, compared to things like Tetris, which is by far one of the best graphic novels you could purchase, or Andre the Giant, the thing that gets everybody hooked on this whole thing. This Cannabis book was really interesting because I thought, I didn't know what it was going to be about. And it turns out it's about why weed is so hated in the United States. And, in a kind of across the, like, some of the Western countries of the world, but it's primarily focused in America, hence the title. And, he talks about how it's basically just a big thing that has to do with race. And I never knew that. I think, there are terrible stereotypes that exist, out there today, that associate, weed with one type of person or another. But, to see like the history of things as it, marijuana moved from, India over to the United States and became very popular with migrant workers and stuff in the South. And then it became associated with just like people of color in general. So cops who were clearly racist were just arresting people for being, non-white, because they could say, oh, you're likely to have marijuana on you. And then marijuana becoming this illegal thing, as more and more people used it, and they wanted to be able to crack down more on people of color. It's like, Box Brown is clearly like inserting maybe some of his own opinions into the book, but at the same time, the entire book is super well sourced, which I think is it's an amazing journey that you follow throughout the book as things go from I want to say like the early 1900s to I think the late 90s, early 2000s, as he talks about how things have progressed. And if you know anything about Box Brown, he's like a huge proponent of legal weed in the United States. But I think to his point, like in the book, there isn't a really good reason why weed is illegal, but alcohol is legal, and I think that it's a really interesting book again, and it's probably not as interesting as these biopic books that he kind of does, but still is a wonderful thing, and it's a very, very relevant topic, especially today, where different states across the United States are making weed legal, and then there is this question of how do we handle people that are in jail for possession for these drugs that are now legal? Did they just go free? And should they just go free? Because the answer is fucking yes, as far as I'm concerned. But that's me injecting my own political opinion into the book, but. I feel like I not only am interested in Box Brown's work, but like to see something like that being super relevant. That's a comic I could recommend to anybody who's curious about how things work and why they are the way they are when it comes to marijuana in the United States. So,
that sounds really good. I'm going to pick that up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that book. Again, as you were saying, Mike, I think it's because it's not as personal of a book as his biographical comics that it was tough for me to get into. But yeah, I might have to revisit it after hearing your thoughts on it. As you were talking, the book that sprang to my mind that I think is similar was Kent State by Derf Backderf, which came out last summer. Yeah. And again, that's a book that's very specifically about an event that happened in 1970, at Kent State University, the massacre there. But it's impossible to read it without thinking about the world in 2020, 40 years later.
Oh, man.
It really felt like that could have happened. It could happen today, the same exact scenario. And again, it was a book that's so well researched. It's rooted in history. It's a true story. And at the same time, it was a very emotional book to read, given the current political climate, as that I was reading it in. So similarly, I think to the cannabis book, Kent State was one that really stood out to me as being that reflected the current events in a way that maybe wasn't intended when Derf wrote it.
Definitely. I mean, I have my copy of that book that I've been sitting on for a while, and I can't bring myself to read it because I know how heavy of a subject matter that is.
Exactly, I totally understand, but it's such a great read when you get to it, when you're ready.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can keep going back and forth with books and stuff like that. I'm curious if there were any other thoughts you guys had on terms of like comics that you want to pick up, or comics that like I guess you feel like you've read that have kind of changed your mind about things. Because one of the books that I've been thinking of, I said let's not bounce back and forth, but now I want to do it again. Is Genderqueer. A memoir, which is a story that by Mayo Kobabe, I believe, which was really interesting. As a cis white man, I am not necessarily like extremely educated on like what it means to be someone who doesn't use either he him pronouns, she her pronouns, they them pronouns. There are a bunch of other pronouns that people use across the LGBTQI community, and I think I was trying to find something that could give me like an understanding of just how people go about choosing their pronouns, understanding why someone chooses their pronouns to be different than like the quote unquote cultural norm that we have. And that book really just nailed it on the head in a way that made me truly understand like, oh, this is why someone wants to do that. Like I didn't understand it because I didn't know anybody, or I don't know anybody necessarily that uses those pronouns. And I can't recommend that book enough. I feel like it kind of meanders a little bit around Kababe's life and things like that, but it really, like, they do a really good job of explaining how you like get in, like how your mindset changes as you learn more about who you are as you get older. And like as a straight white guy, like I didn't have that experience because I didn't feel like I was different or like different than the way the world was trying to treat me. But yeah, I can't recommend that book enough, if only to like educate yourself, because at this point, like I think a lot of this is us, this topic is kind of focused around just educating yourself around different things. And yeah, that's definitely another one that I could think of, but yeah.
Yeah. I second that. Definitely.
Yeah. That's a tremendous book.
Great book.
And yeah, I had a similar experience, Mike. It helped me understand things that were new to me in a way that are part of me now. You know, I now have friends that are non-binary, and I feel I have a better understanding of maybe their experiences, or, you know, maybe what they're comfortable with, you know, in terms of that, pronouns and things. So it's interesting. An odd sort of segue, a book that I had similar reaction to was The Green Lantern by Grant Morrison and Liam Sharp, which just concluded.
Okay.
That book is really fascinating, and I have to go back and reread it now because the last issue connected things in a way I didn't expect. Now, in the middle of that series, it was kind of split into 2 seasons, quote unquote. In the middle of when the book was coming out, Morrison gave the interview where they identified themselves as being genderqueer or non-binary. And it's impossible to read the last few issues of this series without thinking about Morrison using the Green Lantern and using the comic itself to come to terms with their gender identity. You know, it's all there in the text. You have Hal Jordan meeting other Hal Jordans from across the multiverse, one of which is super masculine and one of which is a woman. And it's him trying to make sense of all these conflicting gender identities, but they're all quote unquote Hal Jordan. Again, it's like, I don't know if Morrison was working through stuff when they were writing it, but it's there in the text. And I'm really curious to go back and reread that book to see if there's more stuff that I missed when I first read it.
Yeah, definitely. I've been meaning to catch up on that series, and knowing that came out as they had announced that, I guess, to folks. I didn't even consider that. For some reason, I thought that Green Lantern book was done when they had announced that. So, yeah, now that's time to go back and do a reevaluation of that whole series, right?
Absolutely.
To see it through that lens.
Yeah.
I guess, Zanne, I wanted to talk more about like some of the books that you'd recommend, you know, from like the spectrum of the crossover between, you know, comics and the Bible and stuff like that. And I know that only kind of tangentially touches on some of these things, but you mentioned, you know, you had read some things that had cultural impact that were still like interpretations of the Bible and stuff. Do you have any other recommendations off the top of your head? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but
no, not at all. I do have some more in terms of with the intersection of religion and comics in the Bible. But there was one that I wanted to bring up really quickly. It was the very first one that came to my mind when I thought about the political climate and comics and reflections.
Oh, sure.
And I mean, it's kind of old now. It's about 15 years old. But Sean Tan's The Arrival was one that has made a huge impact on me. And I will go back and I'll read it. I mean, I say read it, it's wordless, obviously, but I'll flick through it or I'll consume it, you know, at least once a year or so. And it had a huge impact on me because it was the first time I really considered what it must be like as an immigrant to go to a strange country where you have no friends or you have no family, you have no backup. The entire book is wordless. It's such strange scenery where there are printed words such as on shop signs. It's all nonsense. So, we become sort of the immigrant where we find it hard to make sense of the world around us. And that book for me is just, it's so incredibly moving and touching. And I just don't know what it must be like for people who have to go through that. So that's one that if you haven't picked up, I mean, I think probably a lot of people have seen it by now, but if you haven't, I would absolutely just please have a look at it. And the artwork is just absolutely stunning. It's one of my favorite types of artwork in comic books. So between Sean Tan and Jeff Lemire, those are my 2 favorite artists in comics.
Gotcha. I just found that online. It looks absolutely gorgeous. I feel like I've seen the cover of this book probably in my entirety of reading comic books, and people are like, you should read this, and then I read the subject matter, I'm like, oh fuck, that sounds really heavy. But like I think that's kind of the point of this topic is like, I think a lot of the things that we're bringing up here is or a lot of the books that we're bringing up here are extremely heavy, but in like the best way possible to get you in the mindset of understanding other people's perception of the world and, putting yourself in their shoes. Cause I think that's the key of a lot of this is to have some empathy for people that are not you. Right. And I think it's obviously the toughest, again, I'm bringing back to the fact that, I am a straight white man. So I want to understand other people and understand like the hardships. One of the notes that I had in here was, it's the troubling part of this though, is, asking people, is there a comic about this? It kind of begs folks to put their trauma out in the open and expose themselves in a way that makes them extremely vulnerable. And you know, for me, I'm trying to be as accepting as possible, but I think for others, it could potentially be, you know, they could react in a way and say, well, that's not exactly how it is, or how come you're portraying people like that? You know, it's kind of like it's kind of a weird thing to put yourself in. I'm not trying to necessarily guilt myself, because I think, you know, my asking that question isn't necessarily like the bad thing here by any means. But I think that just it's really interesting to say, like, you know, you want to educate yourself, but you also don't want to ask people too much. So like, I don't know, write about them, you know, their traumas and things like that, to, you know, have to force them to revisit things that, you know, maybe make them uncomfortable. But I don't know, I might be just getting a bit too into my head about this, you know?
No, I think you're right. But I think actually that a lot of people get catharsis and, you know, almost like a type of therapy through being able to write about or draw about experiences that they've had.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's one of the really amazing things about comics, is that people have the ability and flexibility to do that. You don't have to have some sort of big book contract in order to be successful in comics, because, you know, we have digital comics and we have amazing Comic-Cons all over the world where you can just go and talk to people and show them your art and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think it's a really great medium for that. And if people are uncomfortable doing that or talking about their trauma or reliving it through their art and their drawing, a lot of the time what I've found when I've spoken to people who've done just that is by the time they get to the end of it, for them, they're like, okay, now I understand it better too, and I want you to understand what I went through. So it's actually really important for you to engage with it and to ask for that type of material.
Interesting. Okay, well, that puts things in a great perspective. So thank you for that. Not to, you know, I think that's still a concern, but I think that's a really like positive thing, I guess, to come out of that. If it's helping people, you know, I mean, ultimately, I think alt art does help people, and creating art does help people. And that if it's important stuff, I mean, that's great. So
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're kind of running a little bit long here. Was there any final notes that you guys had before we wrap up here? Anything we didn't touch on by chance?
I just want to maybe underline a point you made recently, that was just saying that we can learn empathy through art. I think art that has value, particularly comics, works when it creates a sense of empathy. You know, so even, you know, we talked about this on the Patreon episode, but even a superhero book like Superman Smashes the Klan is a fun superhero story, and yet it is a book that seems almost designed to create empathy with its characters. And it's that thing where you can enjoy it as a superhero story, and it can also make you try to be a better person at the same time. It's quite amazing to see an art form that is able to juggle that stuff, you know, kind of seamlessly and very easily, it appears.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I wanted to say something that I don't want to end on a downer, but this is something that I think is important to remember too, is that we've talked a lot about the way in which comics can undercut or seriously challenge hegemonic or elite or privileged ideas and question authority and create room for minority voices. But at the same time, we also know that there's this huge hierarchical issue within the world of comics too. There's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on. There's a lot of silencing of those kind of minority voices. So this is something that we have to get our own house in order to before, or so that we can support those minority voices, which I know you do a lot of good work through this podcast doing, but it's just something to bear in mind. I mean, I know we all remember Comicsgate, and that's just one instance of it. So it's about challenging ourselves as well as reading comics that help us challenge political situations.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that reminder, because I think, you know, if someone jumped onto this episode and tried to, you know, just listen to say that, you know, how are things going well in comics for people with, you know, in the minority space? It's like, it seems like it is, because we were able to talk a majority of this episode about people who are writing comic books that are, you know, pushing and are expressing their voices in ways that probably aren't seen in other places. But like, this is just a handful of books in a sea of thousands and thousands of others that aren't necessarily written or created with that in mind. So I definitely agree with you there. I mean, as much as it is a downer note, there's still going to be work. And I think there's always going to be work to make sure that everyone has an equal footing and has an equal voice and can be heard in the same capacity as everyone else. And I think it doesn't help that that we have, the big two publishers who don't do a good job I should say don't do a good job. Like, fuck it. They don't do a good job.
Yes, tell it like
helping.
It is.
Exactly.
I mean, honestly, I don't know why I'm trying to make any calls. Like, Marvel and DC aren't listening to this podcast. So fine. None of the big publishers are listening to this podcast directly. So it doesn't help that those, publishers aren't necessarily making spaces all the time for people to create books that actually positively express those voices without saying we need to have a black person writing a book about a black person. It's I don't think that as much as that is great, we want to have people expressing the voices of people that they're supposed to represent. At the same time, that pigeonholes those creators, right? The fact that there have been no women ever writing Batman ever, the main Batman book. I'm pretty sure someone fact check me out there, or Detective Comics or something like that. One of those things has had a huge run, and they've never had a woman write lead writer, written by themselves as a sole writer. Is fucked up, right? And and it's so bizarre to me to think that you can't have a person of color writing a book about a bunch of white people or something like that. And it has happened and stuff, but it happens less frequently than you think, because I think it's from one point it's to say it's great that we have, the big two are hiring diverse creators and stuff like that, but they're still getting pigeonholed and saying, oh, well, you are this, therefore you should write this about a person who looks or is the same as you in some capacity. And as much as that feels like progress, it's not as much progress as I think a lot of the comics community or some of the comics community, I think the whole comics community should want. And we should be pushing against these creators or the publishers harder to say diversify your entire lineup. Stop being so, I don't know, let the story tell the story, right? I don't know. I haven't prepared any thoughts on this. This is just me freestyling, folks.
I totally agree. And I think the one way that we do support those communities is by spending our money with them rather than always with the big two.
Sure.
Get those people to a point where they can start pitching to the big two and that show that they have this community of support behind them, that we want them to produce these comics and so forth. So that, use our voices in that respect and use our I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm privileged. Use my privilege to lift other people up.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, we're not reading this stuff in a vacuum. So the choices you make, the comics you buy, they're a reflection of your values, and it's something to keep in mind, when you're engaging with it.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Which is why I'm going to put the stamp on it again. Don't buy NFTs. Don't support creators that are pushing NFTs. If you care about the environment, that's the thing that is hot right now. So we're going to mention in the episode. So some transcriber out there is going to pick up this show, and we're going to get in trouble about it. But okay, well, I guess let's wrap up here. We are kind of running out of time. So Zanne, I want to thank you so much for coming on the episode. This has been an amazing discussion. We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the chance to have a voice here. Absolutely. We'll have to have you come back. Could be really fun to talk about something else that's maybe not so serious in the future. Once once you get your book published, we'll figure it out from there. Oh God, yes. Please let me get out of the way. Well, cool. I guess, but before we wrap up here, then where can people find you on the internet if they're curious about other things, or if you're on the internet in some capacity, if they want to read things that you've maybe written? Yeah, sure. If you Google my name, you'll probably find a list of my publications if you're really, really desperate to read some boring, dry academic stuff. Some of it's okay. But you can find me on Twitter at Zanne Domoney-Lyttle. I'm sure you can put that in the show notes. And you're welcome to chat with me there. I do tweet a lot about Bible and gender and sexuality, and not as much about comics at the moment. So that's just me giving you a disclaimer. Well, we're going to sick all of our listeners on you to talk about the Bible and comics all at once. Excellent. Thanks. I look forward to it. Awesome. Well, you can always follow us on Twitter. You can follow Paul at Ohio Paula. You can follow me at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at IRCB Podcast, where I try to post as often as I can. This episode first aired on Patreon and is made possible because of our wonderful patrons. If you'd like to listen to our Patreon exclusive series like the IRCB Movie Club, Saga of Saga, and more, you can join at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. If you haven't already, please take a minute to rate and review the show. I think 5 stars is a fair rating. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It honestly does help the podcast and get the word out about IRCB. Make sure you're on the IRCB Discord, where you can come and chat about comics and other things, listen to our episodes live, and come hang out with us once a month when we do our monthly hangouts. That's at ircbpodcast.com/Discord. And it would help us a lot if you told your friends and maybe your local comic book shop about the show. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. Xander is our editor and just a wonderful person to talk to about headphones and hairstyles and things like that. I want to say thank you to Zanne and Paul for being on this episode. Thank you to everyone in the Discord for listening. Aaron, BN, Cinco, who else is in here? A bunch of other people, Danny. And I want to say thank to everyone out there who's listening to the show. We really, really appreciate it. And remember, until next time, comics are good, and so are you.